Welcome, everyone, to another episode of our podcast, the SERMAPod, which is the podcast for the Sports and Entertainment Risk Management Alliance. I am Rich Lenkov, the founder and CEO of SERMA. I'm also the host of the SERMAPod. We're also very lucky today to have a co-host who is our new intern on the SERMAPod, Mike Malamed. I'll let you introduce yourself, Mike, in a moment, but Mike's been doing a great job booking a lot of great guests like our guest today. Mike, tell us a little bit about what you're doing and what you hope to accomplish.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Rich. Jonathan, it's great to meet you. Thanks for coming on. I'm a law student currently, and I've been interning with SERMA, helping Rich book industry leaders for the SERMAPod, and it's been a great experience so far, and we're lucky to have you on the podcast, and I'm excited to ask you some questions today.
I'm just going to put our official podcast mascot on the ground here. That's
there we go.
That's Ziggy Stardust right there. Ziggy, try to be quiet. All right, we've got Jonathan Hirschler here, who is co-founder and CEO at Signify, which is a platform that he'll be discussing shortly, dealing with protecting athletes from online abuse. Joining us from uncharacteristically sunny London. Jonathan, thanks so much for joining us on the podcast.
Thanks for having me. Good to be here.
All right, so you've been engaged in this platform for a while, a few years. Tell us what it is, first of all, and what you're trying to accomplish.
So Signify is a data science company. We call ourselves an ethical data science company because we were born out the world of Cambridge Analytica and lots of organizations making a bit of a mess of data science. And we wanted to prove that you could use data anonymously, but for really, really smart, but really ethical uses. And we ran the company for the first few years, basically helping clients understand their audiences using social media data. That was the core of the company. About 2-3 years into the process, we realized that we had another capability that allowed us to work out not just how a message could activate an audience, but where a message was coming from as well. And that led us to set up a service called Threat Matrix, which is focused, as you've suggested, it's focused primarily on the detection, analysis, understanding, and actioning of online abuse, taking really big data sets and understanding where abuse is coming from, how it's being targeted, the tactics that are being used, and basically protecting athletes and players in different sports. We've focused on sports, but we also look outside sports as well. And we've been doing that service, Threat Matrix, for about 3-4 years now. We now work with pretty much all the major sports across the world, and have been doing this at really big events, major sporting events across the world.
So obviously, Jonathan, online abuse, bullying, I mean, these are things that we've been dealing with for quite some time. It's a major issue, continues to be a major issue. There's lots of discussion constantly in our country about regulating the social media. There was a hearing involving Facebook not too long ago, and some other social media groups. So it's obviously a pervasive problem in society in general and among youth in general. But what is it particularly about athletes that makes this problem even a little more difficult to deal with?
I mean, honestly, there's nothing special about athletes that attracts this, other than the fact that they have profile. They are on your screens. They are in your faces every day. They have, emotive, I should say, followings in terms of the fan bases behind them. So when you win, everything's great. When you lose, you're really pissed off and angry with the person that's made you lose. So there's a lot of emotions in sports, and that does add to the levels of abuse that we pick up. But fundamentally, it is about profile, and these are some of the most followed accounts on the planet. And we've covered World Cup finals in soccer, for example, which have literally billions of people watching. So the profile of those matches, the profile of those athletes and those individuals leads to triggers abuse.
Yeah, Jonathan, I have a quick question here. So obviously, on that same note, it seems there'd be a ton of demand for a software like this on the university level. within campuses, within students. So have you had schools individually reach out to your company and say, we'd like to have a partnership to protect our students within the community? I know you're mostly focused on athletes, but it seems that there would be a ton of demand for this software on a more broad scope.
Yeah, we've spoken to a number of US colleges, particularly looking at the sort of athletic side. And of course, we're working with the NCAA as well,
Right.
more widely across the US. But we have done some really interesting work in that space and are doing a lot more. The conversations we've had with, actually, the recent conversations with a number of colleges relate a little bit more outside of athletics, and they're looking at some of the issues that are going on. With the protests that are happening in college campuses at the moment, which are obviously a real problem and do follow through onto social media as well. But the core work we've done in US colleges is around sports.
So
yeah, that makes sense.
Just picking up on that point, more than ever, college athletes are, really out there in the world, right? I mean, Caitlin Clark is the most prominent example of an athlete who's transcended Iowa basketball. She's now in the WNBA, but when she was a college athlete, she was larger than life. I mean, I think they shattered records in viewership for the women's Sweet 16. Does the fact that these athletes are now getting NIL money, they're getting NIL deals, and also the rise in gambling, how have those two factors affected the abuse that these student athletes face?
I mean, you've kind of laid it out in the way you've asked the question. You've kind of laid out exactly what the problem is, and it goes back to what we said right at the beginning of the conversation today. It's about profile, and NIL is all about profile. It's all about the profile of those athletes, their ability for them to now make money off of those profiles. They are all keen to have really big social media followings. You've got athletes like Olivia Dunn who've got millions of followers. You've talked about Caitlin Clark, Angel Reese in women's basketball as well. Really high profile athletes, massive followings, simply leads to the kind of levels of abuse that we're seeing that have been quite publicized. And then you bring in the other additional element that you've mentioned, Rich, which is gambling. And it's a nasty mix of money, betting, and sport that is problematic when it comes to online abuse. They are all triggers. So the gambling piece is a particularly interesting one and not as well studied as it should be. But we've done quite a lot of work in it, starting initially in tennis. We did a lot of work with some of the international tennis authorities, and we still work with them now to study the link between gambling, inappropriate contact, and match fixing, and the sport itself. And we picked up a lot of abusive messages being targeted in two ways. One, to try and put a player off, to try and make them lose a game, miss a point, put them off their game. And two, once they've lost the game or won a game in some cases, and they've contributed to somebody losing a bet, the anger that comes from that is then targeted at them afterwards, and that can be pretty nasty. And it's in one study we did looking at a major Grand Slam tennis event, over a third of the abuse that we picked up targeting the players at that event was triggered by or a consequence of gambling, angry gamblers, and betting.
Right. On that note, in the article I sent you, Jonathan, when I asked you to come on the podcast, there's a lot of talk about individual prop bets being legalized. That's something that the NCAA is harping on. Like, should we make that illegal? Because is that causing more of the harassment? But is it fair to say that with things like fantasy sports and with wagering on the outcome of games, there's always going to be a reason for fans to get upset about the players and their roles within those games? Is it fair to say that, obviously there's way more layers to that issue. Removing individual prop bets is not really an effective remedy for the online harassment issue.
I mean, the NCAA have looked at this issue. They are, exactly as you said, Michael, they're trying to take some action across a number of different states, and I think they've had quite a bit of success in removing it in college sports in a number of states at the moment. The view, the evidence, the data that we've seen suggests that that's the right thing to do, and that some of the abuse is being triggered by people making specifically those types of bets. So it is quite interesting. The data definitely backs the position that the NCAA are taking, and I think we're going to see a lot more of that going forward, particularly as gambling is what is relatively new to the US in the way that it is at the moment, and particularly across university campuses, college campuses. The prop bet specifically is a very unique way of putting money down, identifying a very specific element of a match, a game, and betting against it. And that, again, it sort of funnels the focus of anger around one particular moment and one particular athlete. So to us, it makes a lot of sense to follow the approach that the NCAA are taking. And, their key focus is about protecting athletes, college athletes in particular. So it makes a lot of sense to us.
Right.
So to what, I know you're not, psychologist or a psychiatrist, but in this space, to what do you attribute the rise in abuse of athletes? Obviously, the ability to be a keyboard warrior, right, and criticize anyone in real time as the game's going on makes this much more pervasive and permissive. There's really no repercussions to someone going on TikTok or Twitter or wherever and criticizing someone in real time. I guess that's one factor. The overall, climate that we've seen that many attribute to what's going on in the presidency. Many attribute, our former President Trump criticizing courts, criticizing politicians, calling people names. A lot of them attribute that to this more permissive attitude towards criticism. To what do you attribute? Maybe those are two factors, but what else is going on that makes this such a continued and growing problem in your mind?
Well, actually, let's pick up the last point first. The sort of involvement of politics in sport is something we've seen coming through quite a lot. We worked on I mentioned we've worked at World Cups with FIFA, for example, and one of the key things that we've seen, one of the biggest triggers of abuse has actually been politicians getting involved. Yeah. And sometimes, very well-meaning, you have, Kamala Harris coming on and saying good luck to the women's team before a match. And, the US, much like the UK and everywhere else at the moment, is pretty divided politically. So if someone from one side comes in and wishes good luck, everyone on the other side has to get on their backs and start sending abuse. So actually, politics is a major issue in sport in that way, in that it's a trigger of online abuse. So that's one thing worth mentioning. Another thing, to respond to some of the points you just made, Rich, is you said there's, in many cases, there's no repercussions, and that is a problem. And it's one we've been trying to fix. And we've had some success on that lately as well. For example, work we did at the Rugby World Cup very recently, working with World Rugby. They asked us to look at protecting every player that took place that had a social media account, but also they wanted us to put a very specific focus on match officials. And we didn't really fully understand just how bad the problem was for match officials in rugby until we ran this exercise at the World Cup in Paris late last year. But they received over half of all abuse being targeted at, including all players at the finals. The match officials received more than half of it. So major problem there. I raise it because within that, we've been told many times by a lot of people in many different countries, getting arrests, identifying the people who send this abuse, creating real world change and real world deterrence is really difficult. In some countries, it's impossible. Yet, with the work we did at the Rugby World Cup, we've managed to get arrests and prosecutions in countries where that's never happened before for malicious communications, like Australia and New Zealand. And that's a deterrent. That creates a deterrent. And we're not looking for hundreds of those, but you get one and you have a authority like World Rugby who are willing to talk about it, and some really brave match officials who are willing to press charges and follow through in the courts. And suddenly you've got a real deterrent there, because those keyboard warriors you talk about, if they just think twice before sending that message, even if they think they're doing it anonymously, then the work that we're doing is having an effect, and the repercussions will be there. They will realize they cannot get away with those kinds of things. So, we've done a lot of work in that space, and we're really focused on making sure that there are repercussions and there is real world action. And that's something that we're really keen to do. And the last thing I'll say on that actually is the work we've done in the US in particular. Organizations like the FBI and law enforcement, they're very keen to follow up on that. They're very keen to take action, to put repercussions in place, to put deterrents in place. And we really applaud that and the work that they do.
Well, I got a really interesting point. I got two more questions, but one of them I'm going to add just based on what you raised, because on the one hand, I think we agree that, a lot of this is happening online. On the other hand, a lot of it is happening on the ground level, at the grassroots.
Yeah.
And it really starts there. I coach a lot of teams. I've been coaching forever. And I think more than ever, people feel that they could criticize officials. They could attack officials physically, right? We've seen hundreds of examples of that. They could criticize amateur coaches, parents like me who are doing it, as volunteers, and they could attack players. I mean, there's endless amounts of videos of, parents, bystanders, fans going after, amateur players as low as like grammar school. So I think it's crazy out there how people feel that they are allowed to be that critical of amateur players. I think it really starts there, unfortunately. And that's obviously a bigger problem that I'm not sure, your platform could deal with, right? I mean, that's
no, we're not set up to deal with the sort of grassroots level in the way that you've just described it. However, I would say there is a very clear link between online abuse and a rise in incidents in stadiums and real world issues that are going on. You've sort of raised one of those elements, which is and we see it. I'm a massive soccer fan, and for years we've had a major problem in the UK with the way that Premier League players right at the top of the game will, talk back to referees and match officials, and the kind of the kind of way that sets young players out to look at doing the same thing, and that they feel like they can do the same thing because they're following the Premier League players doing that. So, the laws of the game have to change in order to deal with that right at the top, to make sure that it follows through all the way down to grassroots. But that link that I mentioned between online abuse and what goes on in the real world and what happens in stadiums, there is something there. And I say that because if you start to show that there are repercussions with the online abuse that's being sent, it can have an effect in the real world as well. It can have an effect and make people think, well, I can't get away with that. I can't write that online. I can't say that to someone in the real world. And people are really brave when they're keyboard warriors and they're anonymous and they think that they can't be caught. But if they can be caught there, then you would expect that in a stadium where there are now 500 CCTV cameras focused on you, you won't be able to get away with it there either. So I think there is a link. I think it hasn't been explored as much as it could be in terms of repercussions and deterrence, but it could be focused on as a way to deal with that problem, even at the grassroots level.
Yeah. Well, Jonathan, we want to hear a little bit more about your platform, but I just have one more question. You mentioned politics, and you mentioned the demonstrations that are going on on campuses all across our country, Canada as well, involving the conflict in the Middle East. We're about 60 days away from the Olympics starting in Paris. Inevitably, the athletes there who are supposed to be participating in a non-political, non-partisan event, at least the ones who are from the Middle East or from countries that are involved in this conflict, will be subject to not just abuse, but probably threats and all sorts of activities. So how do you see that playing out? I mean, most Olympics aren't, during a conflict like this. This is going to be an interesting Olympics, I think, for sure, in terms of what we're going to see.
It is, and not just the Israel-Gaza situation. Obviously, Russia-Ukraine. There are lots of different things going on in the world at the moment that no doubt will have an influence on the way that the Olympics play out, and some of the things that we see on our screens, and some of the things that people see in the stadiums as well. So, look, it's a real concern. The reason why I'm confident that we can have an influence on that and do something about it is actually it's in the name. The service is called Threat Matrix, and it's called that for a reason. We employ AI to look for a number of different triggers, a number of different flags within an abusive message that will tell us if there is the potential for a fixated threat or real-world threat present there. So we did actually set the service up initially to do exactly that. It was to try and identify whether you can tell the difference between, I love you, a fan saying I love you to an athlete, and I love you so much I'm going to kill you and really want to come after you or going to hurt myself, or those kinds of things. Now that sounds like a reasonable thing to be able to pick up. Like you could read that and see the difference between the two messages. But can you do that at an Olympics or in a World Cup when you're looking at 20 million messages? How do you pick that up? So the AI is set up to do exactly that. It's there to look for not just discriminatory abuse, general abuse, and other sort of categorizations of abuse, but it's also there to look at threat and to identify it. So, we work at some of these really big events in order to try and identify some of these things and protect players. And we work with security teams and pass information through as quickly as we can to identify some of those issues as soon as they become present in any of the messages we're picking up. So that's how we operate. And I know, and fortunately, we're working with some really good people. And there are some really good people at the platforms as well who will also be looking for some of these issues and trying to deal with that as well. So, look, will there be issues? Undoubtedly, there will be issues. Can we pick them up and be as vigilant as possible? And I'm not just talking about our company now. I'm talking about the platforms and other organizations who are trying to do this. I'm confident that we can. I'm confident that there is goodwill to try and do that and to protect athletes as far as possible. But, there are, like any event that's ever taken place, there are the risks and there are the concerns, and they're being heightened at the moment because of what's going on geopolitically. And that is a concern. It's definitely a concern. So it's keeping everyone on their toes, including us at the moment.
Jonathan Hirschler, co-founder and CEO of Signify Group. Thank you so much for joining us to discuss this very interesting and timely topic.
Thanks for having me.